Hey guys, the Common Man here. So I just wanted to shoot a quick video on this. If you're on the hunt for a knife, but you're not quite sure what lock style or deployment method you want to go with, maybe it doesn't matter to you at all, but hopefully this video might help clear some things up or give you some idea of what's out there. So I've lined up a few different knives here, and this doesn't cover all the lock styles. I promise you there's a ton out there, and I actually have knives of different lock styles that I'm not going to throw in this because I could make this video an hour long if I throw them all in. So this is just kind of a basic overview of some of the most common ones that you're going to see. And again, if I'm missing something, sorry, these are just what I decided to throw in. So it's kind of from most basic all the way up to kind of more interesting or a little bit more complex, kind of in a row here. So let's go ahead and start with the first. This is going to be your classic slip joint. This is usually what you see in like case knives or like a classic traditional folder. And all this is a back spring that's got some tension on it. And when you open up that knife, and this has a beautiful or a half stop. Some of them don't have this. This one does. I do really like the half stops. But you can see when you open up that knife, it lifts up that back spring, which is pinned here, fixed here, and it just adds some tension, and it sort of locks into position right like that. And usually it requires a fair amount of force. You usually have to use a nail nick or something like that to get a good grip on that blade. But it's just very basic. You can see you close it. It does not actually lock. And I'm sorry if I called it a lock. It's really not a lock. It just holds the blade in position for you to use it. A knife like this, you want to be very careful that you don't apply any upward pressure if you're pulling back, because that knife blade is going to close up on you. That is the advantage of a half stop, is if your fingers are right here and for any reason this knife blade closes, it's going to protect your fingers from this blade closing all the way on them. So it's still a little bit dangerous. You don't really want to use a knife like this for any real hard use applications, at least in my opinion, because you could find yourself getting hurt. And as far as I know, these are the most common ones that people hurt themselves with, these slip joints. But anyway, that's what that is. It's pretty simple. It's called a slip joint, and it just closes and opens with just a little bit of force. No real disengagement on the lock. You just put some pressure on the back spine, and it closes up. And this knife is pretty cool because it's got a bottle opener / pry bar. Absolutely love this. This is the GEC Sudbuster, Great Eastern Cutlery Sudbuster. Very cool knife. Pretty hard to find. You'd have to find that on the secondhand market. All right, next lock style we're going to talk about, and this is actually a lock. This is the back lock, and what we have here is a Spyderco Delica. Most back locks you can't open like that because they're usually pretty stiff. This one I've got worked in pretty well where it's actually one-hand operational, and that is something to consider with this one as well as the slip joint. These are usually two-hand opening knives. Again, you can get it worked in where you can kind of do one of those things, but usually they are quite stiff. So the way the back lock works is actually not too terribly different than a slip joint, but in this case you actually have kind of a hook on this back spine, and it also is on spring pressure. So usually it's kind of like a rocking system. You can see it's fixed right here. You put downward pressure here, and then this end lifts up and actually unlocks the knife blade from that back spine, and that's what locks and unlocks the knife. This is an extremely strong lock because, as you can imagine, there's two hooks that kind of hook together like this, and for you to break that bond, you'd have to actually break one of those materials, actually snap them. So it's an extremely strong lock, and Cold Steel actually uses a triad lock, which is kind of like a modified version of the back lock, which is even stronger. I don't know exactly how it works, but I do know the back lock is an extremely strong lock, but again, requires two hands for the most part. So do keep that in mind if you're looking at a back lock. Next up is going to be quite simple. This is a liner lock. This one also has a flipper. So liner locks can be deployed in several different ways. You can have flippers, you can have thumb studs, you could have an opening hole, which is just a hole like this right here, where you can kind of put your thumb or your middle finger and flick it. But several different opening options for liner locks. But the way a liner lock works is it's just usually you have like an inner scale to the knife, or an inner I guess the scale really is the covering, but yeah, liner is what it is. Duh, it's a liner, and the liner has a piece of metal which is just kind of like a spring steel. It works as a spring, and essentially that piece is it's bent with memory so that it wants to go inward. So when you close the knife, you actually have to push this piece of metal, which works as a spring, over, and then it kind of makes room for that blade. And you watch how it locks up. So that steel moves over, locks up against the back face of the blade there. And you can see, boom, that's how it locks out. Usually you don't want this over too far. You want this just locked up right on the inner edge of that blade, because if it locks up too far, that means that it's either wearing in or it could potentially push off the other side of the blade, which would cause the blade potentially to close, and it would actually cause a failure in the lock. Liner locks are usually pretty strong, but they are not necessarily the strongest lock out there. They are probably the most common you're going to come across, though. And again, as long as you don't have engagement that's all the way over to the opposite side of the blade, you're in pretty good shape, and this should be a pretty good, reliable lock style. Again, it's very, very common, and I have had many, many knives with a liner lock. Not really my favorite, but it's pretty good. It's a pretty good locking style, but that's what that is. And this is the Civivi Elementum, the original. Next up, we have a frame lock. This is also an extremely common lock style, very similar to the liner lock, but instead of a liner having a piece of steel or a piece of material that moves over, the entire frame moves over. So you can see very similar in its action, very similar in its function, and this one actually has an insert so that this titanium scale doesn't wear against the steel of the blade. But, you know, like I said, much the same as the liner lock. When that knife blade opens, and this may actually be a little bit better demonstration for both of them, you can see that it just kind of slips over, boom, and it engages right there. And you can see the engagement is very early, we would call that. You don't want a super late engagement, but that means that it is not going to find its way all the way over and potentially slipping off the other edge, which really wouldn't be a possibility here. But anyway, usually this is much more robust because the actual frame of knives are usually a little bit thicker, so that's going to give you some more toughness. Downsides to this is you could potentially push this lock bar over too far, and you may actually deform this metal here so it loses its kind of spring action. Other downside is when you are deploying the knife, your finger could actually push on that lock bar and cause it to be very difficult to deploy. So in this case, you know, you don't really have to have your finger there. The flipping action works quite well. I have found that if I want to open it with the thumb stud here, I tend to put my finger against this lock bar, which pushes the lock bar, which has a detent that pushes against the blade, and it causes a lot more friction, making it very difficult to open. And so definitely a downside, but again, with that flipper and different deployment options, that's not always a huge deal. Something to keep in mind if you are looking at frame locks. And again, you can use flipping action, you can use thumb stud, opening hole, lots of different options there. And this is the Rick Hinderer XM18. A little bit hard to get a hold of, but a fantastic, quite expensive knife. Next up, another relatively simple lock. This is actually a pretty simple lock. This is the button lock, and what this is the CJRB Pyrite. This is the premium version. The way it works is, this is a thumb stud opening. You can see that this lock here actually works as the closing mechanism. So kind of, let's see if we can show. Works as kind of like a plunger. You can see that it's got a ledge there, and when I push it over, that ledge actually kind of makes room for that blade to slip through. So let's see if we can make that make sense. So watch how it kind of, boom, it kind of releases it just like that. So it works as the closing detent, you'd call it, as well as the opening mechanism. So you can see that when you close the blade, that button slips over, locks into position, so then you're using shear force. Essentially, you would have to shear that pin right off to break this lock, although sometimes the geometry is not quite right. Unfortunately, for this to operate smoothly, this plunger has to be kind of at a somewhat of like a, oh boy, kind of conical kind of shape. It has to have somewhat of a sloping angle as well as the blade to allow those. If those two surfaces were perfectly flat against each other, you would have friction. Instead, they kind of make the surfaces at an angle, so you're using some Basically, friction isn't going to be such an issue, so that they're easier to kind of pull away from each other, if that makes any sense. But essentially, what happens is if that angle is too much, if it's too much of an angle, it can actually slip, causing that fail to causing that lock to disengage. And there are several knives using button locks that unfortunately were plagued with that issue, and they have, most of them that I know of have since corrected it by changing up the geometry. But that is a potential problem with a button lock. They aren't usually considered to be the strongest lock because of that required geometry for them to work properly. So do understand that a button lock could potentially fail without actually breaking any materials. It's just kind of the natural design of this style. But usually, if you're buying a decent, reputable brand, they're going to have the geometry down, so you shouldn't have to worry too much about that. Just keep that in mind. Again, CJRB Pyrite. The budget version is right around $40 to $50, and I'd highly recommend it. Very good knife. All right, next up we have, this is kind of unique. This is Spyderco Para 3, and it uses their compression lock. And the reason it's called a compression lock is because you'll see when you deploy the blade, and this is using an opening hole, which you can use your thumb for, or the reverse flick, but you can see that when you deploy the blade, this tab actually moves over, and it is resting between this pin here. There's a thick, heavy pin right there, and then the blade has a ledge down below it. That tab moves in between the pin and the ledge, and the reason it's called a compression lock is because if this blade moves down, it would actually have to compress this metal tab that slides into place between the blade and that pin, and the chances of it actually compressing that metal are like none. The only way that this is going to fail is if that pin actually shears or something slips, and that's not usually the case. I've seen some torture test videos of these things, and this compression lock is no joke. It is very, very strong, and it's also extremely intuitive. It's very simple, kind of similar to a liner lock in that all you have to do is move that tab over to disengage it, and you don't have to get your finger in the way of the cutting path, which I really love about the compression lock, as well as the button lock. There's really no way for you to hurt yourself when you're disengaging this knife, and it's also, like I said, just very intuitive. Only downside is you do have to kind of reposition your fingers to disengage that lock. You kind of have to pull your fingers up away from the blade like that. No big deal. I don't see it as an issue. It works so well that this is probably one of my favorite locking styles. I really, really enjoy it. Again, Spyderco Para 3, and Spyderco uses this on a lot of their knives. And then lastly, we have, so this has a couple of different names. Benchmade kind of coined it as the Axis lock. They were the first ones to come out with it. I think that Hogue, this is the Hogue Deca with some original goat aluminum Cerakoted scales. But I think that Hogue calls it the Able lock, if I remember correctly. And then everyone else is calling it the crossbar lock because the patent ran out, and now pretty much everyone's using this locking style. So it is a very common style you're going to see, and I'm just going to go ahead and call it the crossbar lock just to make it simple. So the way that it works is it's pretty simple in its operation. Essentially, you have this bar which slides up. Why is it? Yeah, there we go. Okay, it slides backwards and forwards, and the reason it keeps sliding forward is because it's under spring tension. There is an omega spring in there. It's kind of like it's like a curl sort of, and what it does is it actually forces that bar forward, and in order to come backward, you have to apply force to pull it back against that spring tension, and then it just wants to fly forward. So this is what holds the knife blade closed. You can see that when I open the blade, it does actually move back, and that is because I'm applying force to the blade. I'm pulling it away, and that's sliding that bar out of place. And then when the knife blade opens, it locks in, and you can see that it actually slips up against that ledge, that shiny ledge right there. That lock bar slips right over that ledge, locking it into place. So the only way that this knife can fail is if you shear that bar, or if it breaks out of the back end of these inserts, which is just not likely to happen. So also an extremely strong lock. This I have found can be susceptible to lock stick. But for the most part, you know, most companies have the geometry down pretty well, where lock stick's not too much of an issue. And honestly, because this is no longer Benchmade's kind of proprietary lock, it has been perfected. Omega springs breaking was an issue. For the most part, most companies provide either an extra set of Omega springs or they just make them very durable, so people really aren't having them break. I haven't heard of that as an issue for a long time. So it's a really good durable lock. It's also quite intuitive. Again, you can just kind of pinch it with both fingers and pull it back. This knife's a little bit stiff. Or if it's not super tight, if you don't have a very strong Omega spring, you can with one finger pull it back and disengage that lock, which this one is not too bad, so I can do that. This does allow several different opening options. Usually a thumb stud, or I'm sorry, like a flipper tab usually isn't much of an option because it would get in the way of that lock bar. Usually this is more of like a thumb stud or an opening hole kind of deployment. But yeah, like I said, this is one that you're going to see quite often, and a lot of manufacturers are using it. So that's that, guys. That's like I said, just a handful of different lock styles. These are probably the most common ones that you're going to see, and I really don't think you're going to go wrong with any of them. The only one that I would really be wary of, like I said, is the slip joint, and that's only if you're going to be using it for like hard use applications. Slip joint, not really what I would recommend for something like that. If you want probably the most durable, strongest lock style, the back lock is a very good one to look at, or a frame lock is not too bad. Compression lock is extremely strong as well. And it really just comes down to preference and which knife that you prefer. If you see a knife style that you like in the materials that you prefer, really you're not going to go wrong with any of these. So I wouldn't necessarily discount any of them. But like I said, just be aware of that slip joint not being the safest if you're really going to put in some work with the knife. So anyway, thanks guys. I appreciate you watching. Like I said, this wasn't a comprehensive look at all of the different knife styles or locking styles, just the ones that you're most likely to see. So hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like, and if you want to see more of my knife, EDC, and occasional garage content, please consider subscribing. I greatly appreciate it.